There's been an argument going on for the past 20 years. An argument that, unless you're in the right place at the right time, you've likely never seen before. Despite this, thousands of words have been exchanged on this topic, from Wikipedia disputes lasting nearly a year to obscure forum posts and discussions on social media. The subject of this disagreement has made its way into dozens of published books, websites, and YouTube videos. I started trying to find the answers myself over a year ago, and by now I think I've spent less time and energy during my son's custody battle, and while thankfully I lost that debate, I'm hoping to finish this one today. A Wikipedia user once apologised for coming into this discussion 2 months late, but I'm here 20 years after the fact to definitively answer these questions. Because all of this, all of the text, the links, the crying out for sources, and the accusation of falsifications are over 2 measly words. 2 words that were never meant to be up for debate in the first place. This is how a work of historical fiction accidentally rewrote history. Our story starts in 2005. On the 7th of September, a user added a short sentence into the article Terminology of the British Isles, claiming that the Welsh name for England had a very strange translation: the Lost Country. This stood unsourced and uncontested for 82 days until another user chimed in, asking if anyone could actually confirm this. And this is where we'll address the elephant in the room. Hello, elephant. What exactly is everyone arguing about here? Throughout the world, the country of England is broadly known by 2 names. One should be obvious. It first came about in the 10th century as Engleland, and it's the most commonly used translation across the globe. However, England's neighbours disagree, and almost all of them call this country the land of the Saxons, inhabited by the Saxon people who speak the Saxon language. Almost all of them. Because there's this one little group called Just Wales who disagree. Let's take a peek inside and see who's there, and oh, wouldn't you know it? It's just Wales. Throwing a historical and etymological curveball at the entire world, the Welsh call England Lloegr, and I don't want to bury the lead here. If you were to ask me when my son's birthday was, or any historian what Lloegr means, you would get the same answer. I don't know. Even though this can be found all over the place, the translation of the Lost Country doesn't compute, at least not in the language it's claiming to come from. The Welsh word for lost is colledig, and there are at least a dozen words for land, country, region, or any synonym you can think of. And none of them are here. So why do people keep saying this? Why is this passage here? Other users agreed that they hadn't seen an actual source claiming this translation was accurate, and it was promptly removed. An odd, one-off occurrence, someone making up a claim for no reason. I've made videos covering things like this before, so it's not that unexpected. But that wasn't the end, because 3 months later, another message was added. Apparently, someone had a source. Unbeknownst to these users, 47 days after they first removed it, the Lost Lands were back, this time on the Wikipedia article about the Celtic nations. Here we find a passage claiming that a word that doesn't contain either the term for lost or any of the words for land literally translates as the Lost Lands. Strange. It was noticed much quicker this time. Only 3 days later it was removed and questioned on the talk page, but unlike the last discussion, this time it had supporters. We're told by another user that these lost lands are in reference to England being taken over by the Anglo-Saxons after the Romans withdrew. And to see proof of this translation, we only have to check books on Welsh legends and mythology. Okay. Taking a look inside any Welsh mythology book, such as the famous one, the Mabinogion, quickly reveals to us that this is never mentioned, because again, it can't translate like this. They then tell us that they could give us the names of the books that reference this term, and after a resounding please do, we're given this. 8 links. The promised books and the number of sources referenced on the other article come down to this. 2 topics on answers.com, a number of forums, an amazingly titled website called Electric Scotland, whose logo is a man playing bagpipes with 2 lightning bolts behind him. And that's it. All but 2 of these links are dead, but judging from the response this got, we can see that they are obviously not any good. Apparently 3 of them are Wikipedia mirrors, so they just seem to call Lloegr the Lost Lands because this article does. This user is essentially just citing themselves. they do concede at the very least that this etymology is not certain, and it was eventually removed from the article. It popped up one more time on the Wikipedia page for Wales, but by the 26th of November 2006, that discussion was over, and it was removed, meaning that this entire saga had lasted almost exactly 1 year. But this didn't end here. This isn't an obscure Wikipedia oddity from 2005. This was a piece of false information that had to be removed again and again and again. And now, nearly 20 years later, you can still actively find this claim on websites, articles, social media, YouTube videos, and in 2013 it even made its way into a book, Britain, A Genetic Journey. All the while without any proof, any source, or the ability to actually translate the name like this. I didn't find this myth through these articles. I'd been hearing about this for years, and now that we've seen its first major appearance, we have to wonder, where on earth did this come from? Luckily for us, this year-long debate revealed something very interesting. It didn't start here. This wasn't just made up on the spot and repeated by other users because this individual cited their sources. Now, they weren't any good at proving this translation, but they instead tell us something important. That this myth predates these articles. The Lost Lands seemingly go much deeper and are far older than these pages. The only question is, how old? When I first went looking for the origins of this unusual translation, these Wikipedia pages were actually the last things that I found. Consequently, the final bit of research I had to do before writing this video was to find when these passages were added to the articles, and upon searching for when it was added to the page about Wales, I found something funny that I knew I had to share with you. On the 11th of April 2006 at 6:14 PM, history was made. An anonymous user edited the page for the town of Wigan, England, and had some choice words to say. Unfortunately describing the place as a vomit fried in sheep's guts, somehow spelling nearly everything wrong, before moving on only 4 minutes later. The next target was a little unexpected. At 6:18 PM they went onto the page for chess and deleted all of the text. Finally, at 6:20 they came to the article on Wales, deleting everything and adding back a sentence of their own, which included the very 2000s phrase, "Nuff said." This was their entire career. Nothing more, nothing less. One individual's personal 6-minute vendetta against Wigan, Wales, and chess. 22 hours and 16 minutes prior, the lost lands of Lloegr made their way into the Wales article. How rare and fortunate we are that two works of art were made so closely together. As I mentioned, I didn't find these articles until the very end. Instead, my research began at the same place I tried to start my kidney collection, the internet. It popped up all over the place like I expected, so I had to gradually reverse the clock to see if I could find some of its earliest surviving occurrences and, hopefully, the origin. A page in 2016 cited that book I mentioned earlier, Britain, A Genetic Journey, and claimed that Lloegr meant the Lost Lands, although they were questioned if this translation was possible. In 2014, a comment on the excellent BBC page titled About Herefordshire in all caps also mentioned this, ironically stating that you cannot deny or rewrite history, then telling people to check the ancient Welsh scholars Gildas and Nennius, who, both writing in Latin, never used the word Lloegr, let alone called it the Lost Lands. A comment above this is also really funny, because it sounds like he's writing from the 13th century, complaining about people moving to Herefordshire to build their own castles, like King John complaining about his barons. In 2013, a website called The Old North published an article noting how it wasn't possible to translate Lloegr in this way, instead calling it a popular theory and a late folk etymology. I went back further, to 500 million years ago and nothing. So I went back to 2007 and to what I once believed was the oldest still existing mention of this myth. On the 5th of November, the word of the day on a blog called Omniglot was Lloegr. Multiple etymologies were suggested, but for now all we need to see is another appearance of the Lost Lands. They link to two sites, the first of which seems to have been struck down by the Antiquarian Chronicles block, but luckily the second and actually important one was archived. And here we can see the oldest mention of the Lost Lands that I could find on the internet. Unfortunately it doesn't exist anymore, but luckily it's been preserved in the digital fossil record. On this second website, someone asks what the meaning of Lloegr is. They're given a few theories until in the penultimate post, an old friend appears. Lloegr are the Lost Lands. I know, I was born there. Try using that as a source in your exam. The final post, on the 21st of December 2002, agrees with them. And that's it. I could find nothing older online. I went into this expecting to find the origins on the internet somewhere. A simple rumour started by a random user, an odd occurrence in a comment section or a Wikipedia article, but no. Even after I found the Wikipedia articles, the oldest still existing mention I could find was only from 2003. This was clearly much older than that. People were referencing it without explanation like it was a pre-established fact. This individual had even been told this when he was a kid. So how old was this mystery exactly? How old could this spurious translation really be? It was around this time that I began to notice just how often people had been citing far older texts from centuries ago. Could the origins of the Lost Lands really lie as far back in the past as these people claim? How deep does this conspiracy go? Let's play the classic fun family game of examining medieval Welsh sources in search of the origins of a myth. I'll go first. Throughout this digital excavation, we've seen plenty of claims, and by now none were more interesting to me than the suggestion that our lost lands had their origins over 1,000 years ago. We've seen the less than convincing suggestions. The books on Welsh legend and mythology turned up nothing, and the ancient Welsh scholars of Gildas and Nennius wrote in the wrong language for this exercise. Despite this, the idea isn't entirely without merit, otherwise I wouldn't have bothered looking into it. I have better uses for my time, like installing a stable in my living room. Since Lloegr is the Welsh name for England, it's pretty easy to find mentions of it in the old manuscripts. The Annals Cambria, albeit written in Latin, mentions it once, describing how the Vikings ravaged Lloegr and some neighbouring regions in 894. The Annals prefer to call the English the Saxons though, just like how the English are called Saeson in Welsh today. As you can see by this graph, the most commonly used term is Rex Saxonum, with Lloegr only coming up a single time, and without any reference to this meaning the Lost Lands. In the 9th century, a poem references the now lost kingdom of Penguern fighting against the Lloegroes, the men of Lloegr, but no mentions of Lost Land here. The name also comes up in another poem, one that potentially has its origins in the 6th or 7th centuries, detailing the military exploits of the Britons in the north. Here, they fight in Lloegr against the men of Lloegr, but again, no Lost Lands are mentioned. In fact, in the historian John Koch's 409-page analysis of this poem, the word lost comes up 26 times, but our lost lands of Lloegr never make an appearance even once. That's an average of one lost every 15.7 pages and 0 lost lands per page, the same ratio that my son appears in my will. Another text from the 9th century, known as Armes Prydain Fawr, also mentions Lloegr, this time calling for a united force to rise up and drive the Saxons out, but it never calls this country the Lost Lands. Finally, Lloegr comes up in an equally antiquated text known as the Trioeds. Here, we're introduced to two English kings from the north, Athelfrith and Edwin, who are both called Brenin Lloegr, the kings of Lloegr, not the kings of any lost land. However, it seems that some people believe we can find something close in these triads. The website that called the Lost Lands a late folk etymology suggests that it was based on the following triad, describing how the Welsh had lost their lands and their privilege and their crown in Lloegr. That's quite close. It's not exact, but it's something. However, we have one issue. Despite what was claimed, that passage isn't in the triads. Following a multi-hour dive down a secondary rabbit hole, I was able to trace this quote to a text from 1820, which cites the Myvyrian Archaeology of Wales, a book from 1801 which, unfortunately, published a number of forged and altered manuscripts. In this case, a man named Iolo Morgannwg altered and, quote, added fresh material to a group of triads published as the third series. Since he is the only source for this passage, it is at the very least highly untrustworthy. And based on his track record for altering manuscripts which we do have other copies of, it's not looking good. He did not, however, create this etymology. Nowhere in the 358 pages dedicated to the triads is this claimed, and I managed to confirm that the original text just says that the Welsh lost their Trioedd, Prydain and Corron in Lloegr, accidentally proving how impossible it is to directly translate Lloegr into the Lost Lands in Welsh, here written as Trioedd Collasant, and it wasn't in any of his unpublished manuscripts either. The closest I could find was a reference to the Welsh losing the crown and sceptre of London and being driven from Lloegr, but no claim that Lloegr means the Lost Lands, and again, as Iolo wrote in Welsh, I think even he would have a hard time convincing people that these words were one and the same. Sometimes there is no greater demonstration of the scientific method than spending hours and hours researching something only to come away with it being entirely irrelevant. With that long rabbit hole complete, I came away feeling disappointed. I'd seen this claim of antiquity repeated a lot, but just like the original claim that this name literally translates to the Lost Lands, it just didn't seem to be true. This did, however, add to the mystery, because as we've seen, this name predates England by potentially a few hundred years, and yet we seem to have no idea what it actually means. My first theory of this myth having its origins online was disproven. The oldest sources I could find, whether they still existed or not, all described this translation as a pre-existing fact, albeit never saying where they got it from, or at least not giving a reliable source. This was clearly older than the early 2000s, but by how much? My second avenue, the medieval sources, also confirmed what I already thought, that no one back then claimed this meaning either. It would be very hard to claim this in Welsh, of course, as we've seen, but this left us with a centuries-long gap where this myth could have grown and developed. So I had one final place to check. How time-consuming could it be to look at 800 years worth of history? The oldest explanation for this name appears in a 12th century text, the History of the Kings of Britain, a heavily mythologized and very often fictionalized history of Great Britain. Here, the King of Britain divides the island amongst his sons. Albanactus is given Albany, which is Scotland, Camber gets Cambria, aka Wales, and Lloegr receives Lloegr, which is all of England except for Cornwall. All of these follow the very common Welsh poetic trope of explaining place names by claiming they were named after a guy. Sometimes these are based on real names like Caredig or Rhifon, other times they're named after people like Camber and Lloegr, names that do not exist, have never been used, and were created solely to explain where these place names came from. While this doesn't help us know what Lloegr means, it does at least rule out this source as the origins of the Lost Lands, as it only claims Lloegr was named after this man. It also tells us something very interesting though, that at least by the 12th century, Lloegr was a name that warranted explanation. I had to keep moving forward, since I had another 700 years worth of text to examine, and I only had an hour before I had to go pick up my son. In 1573, Humphrey Lloyd mentions the Saxons invading the country which we call Lloegria, or England. No lost lands. Jumping forward to 1707, and Edward Lled publishes a Welsh dictionary, defining Lloegr as England on this side of the Humber, excluding Wales and Cornwall. Not only does this imply that England can morph and shift depending on what side of the Humber you're reading this dictionary on, but it also clearly doesn't define it as anything but England. The part about the Humber, if you're curious, is a callback to the history of the Kings of Britain. Later on in the story, England is partitioned and it becomes Northumbria north of the Humber and Lloegr to the south. Nearly 100 years later and we still don't have anything. Here in 1803, in another extremely low-resolution dictionary, Lloegr is described as the popular name for England. The author connected to a Welsh word, Lloeg, which as far as I could see doesn't seem to be in any modern dictionary, defining it as to open or to break out. A strange etymology, but no lost lands. He also once again says that, properly speaking, it should only apply to England south of the Humber, claiming that Lloegr was the land inhabited by the ancient Belgians, finally proving once and for all that England is rightful Belgian territory. In 1850, someone brought up an apparent theory that Lloegr is connected to Liguria in Italy, a suggestion that also came up in 2007. The author disputes this as groundless and instead defines it as the lowland country. Once again, no lost lands. Finally, in 1888, we're back to Iolo Morganu's unpublished manuscripts, and again, nothing. The window is rapidly narrowing now. We've eliminated a post-2002 origin and now a pre-19th century one. And we only have about 100 years where this could have come up, but we still haven't seen it, and now I'm getting nervous. After this mystery date, the lost lands of Lloegr are everywhere. Books, videos, comments, it's even appeared on my walls, but before it doesn't seem to exist at all, anywhere. I was beginning to develop an unusual and persistent itch, which was only exacerbated when I reached all the way to 1987, where I found an article mentioning the lost lands of Wales, only for it to define this as Shropshire, Herefordshire and Gloucester, the 3 counties bordering Wales, not England as a whole, and not Lloegr. We are cutting it so fine here that I no longer believed this myth came about gradually or under any degree of obscurity. Nowhere in these 15 years did someone on an old forum come up with this or an unknown publication. I was starting to doubt whether this even existed at all. Did everyone sometime between the 1980s and 2002 get beamed with this information from an extraterrestrial source? Aliens sent to Earth with the explicit purpose of making me research this for so long that I end up being 19 days late to picking up my son? No, of course not. I would have picked him up late regardless of whether I was actually doing anything. But these lost lands must have come from somewhere big, somewhere famous. People have referred to this as ancient folk etymology. This guy was told this explanation as a kid, yet nothing prior to 1995 even seems to mention the words Lloegr and lost lands within the same breath, and... Oh, wait a second. I found something. After days and days of research on a topic I began over a year ago, I found something. 1995. These are the tales of the land we call Lloegr, which means the Lost Lands. Arthur, who would take back the lost lands of Lloegr. Lloegr, the Lost Lands. These are all quotes from a trio of novels known as the Warlord Chronicles, written by the highly accomplished Bernard Cornwell. You may know him best as the author behind the novels that the TV show The Last Kingdom was based on. Today, however, I know him best as the first source I could find prior to any of the modern appearances that directly called Lloegr the Lost Lands. In fact, in the second book, it's even given a definition: that part of Britain occupied by the Saxons, literally the Lost Lands. So, that was it then. I'd found it. These books were very popular. They came out at just the right time for this translation to catch on, for people to be told about the Lost Lands as a kid, and then grow up, go on the internet, and tell people that this was the definition they'd always been told. Fast forward 10 years, and people try adding it to Wikipedia articles, with this false translation from a work of fiction gradually making its way down the grapevine until it absolutely exploded, and can now be found everywhere from YouTube videos to social media comments to books about oysters. And look, some comments on Wikipedia cite him too. Do I wish I'd found these any sooner than the actual last pieces of information for this video? Yes. I suppose they only have themselves to blame, right? After all, these are works of historical fiction. Not everything that occurs within actually happened in real life, just like how the medieval Welsh never, and actively could not, translate Lloegr as the Lost Lands. This question from 2011 on Cornwell's website says that they learnt this meaning from him, and in an answer to another question 4 years later he mentions it again. Answering a question about the themes of his trilogy, he tells the individual to remember that the Welsh name for England is Lloegr, the Lost Lands, connecting this to a central theme of his work. He doesn't say that this works within the context of his novel. He cites it as a current, modern translation. Come to think of it, in his second novel he lists the places named within, and he marks the fictional ones with an asterisk, even if they're based on real places. Cadbury is a real place, but Caer Cadairn was invented for this novel, so it has an asterisk. Lloegr is a real place, but this translation was, seemingly, invented for this novel, no? So it should have had an asterisk. But it doesn't. Because it wasn't invented by Cornwell. Did this novel popularize it? Absolutely. Based on how popular this false translation has become, how often it is cited and claimed, you could say that these novels accidentally rewrote history. But it is not the origin. This was originally where this video ended. When I first researched all of this months ago, this is where I ended up. But when I came back to it in these past few weeks, I noticed all of these signs that pointed to Cornwell earnestly using this translation and genuinely believing that it was accurate. So while he may have popularized this myth, as we can see from all of these places repeating his wording and citing his influence, he did not create it. So after all of this, thinking that I'd already found the answer, I was still not finished. And while part of me may have wanted to give up, by now I owed it to myself to find out the truth. It's time for one final dive down the rabbit hole. Bernard Cornwell's clear and earnest belief in this lost land myth was my first clue that he hadn't invented it. But my second clue is far more useful: the spelling. Keen-eyed viewers, or those of you using the subtitles, may have noticed that this spelling of Lloegr is slightly different than usual. If we consult this graph, we can see that the Y levels are way up, and that's because there's an extra Y here. Gross, I know, but why? Well, it seems to be an old spelling, popping up in the Trioedd, some old poems, and a few English language sources in the 17 and 1800s. I had already been searching using this spelling since I knew it was fairly common back then, but going back and looking in every book I could find published between 1980 and 1995 that used Lloegr with a Y, I found two things. Firstly, all the way up to 1991, Lloegr was still defined as just England, usually south of the Humber and sometimes named after Lloegr, showing the timeless influence of the history of the kings of Britain. However, in 1992, everything changes. Yugoslavia dissolves, George Bush throws up on the Japanese Prime Minister, and the minor planet 15760 Albion is discovered. Bearing the Greek name for the island of Britain, is it just a coincidence that in this very same year, Lloegr, England, the largest country in Great Britain, would have its meaning changed forever? Probably. But here, in 1992, a book is published, The Dictionary of Celtic Mythology, and inside we can find the following. Lloegr, the Lost Territory. Apparently, it was what the British Celts called the lands conquered by the Anglo-Saxons. This is the earliest occurrence, to my knowledge, of Lloegr being referred to as the Lost Lands or Territory. Even in books published only a year prior, Lloegr is described as just England, usually south of the Humber, without this translation, and without this definition. So where did this author get this from? I think so far I'd actually been quite naive. I was hoping to just find a book that said, here's this thing I made up. But of course that's not going to be the case. If this myth was popularized by a successful series of novels, which got this definition from a properly published book, then surely there must have been a mistake, somewhere. No author would just invent a definition for a serious work, and we passed the prime hoaxing era a long time ago. No. At this point I knew I wasn't going to find something as straightforward as I wanted. In the space of a year, Lloegr went from England south of the Humber to the Lost Territory conquered by the Anglo-Saxons. Something had changed, and I believe the key is in this new definition and this old spelling. Two years prior, 1990, two books were published by the famous and accomplished Arthurian historian Geoffrey Ashe. Within these texts, the mythology of the British Isles and the kings and queens of early Britain, we can find two very pertinent things. The first is this old spelling of Lloegr again, and the second were the following three claims. One, that the Welsh referred to the parts of Britain conquered by the Anglo-Saxons as Lloegr. Two, that they, quote, referred to its transformation as the loss of Lloegr by the Cymry. And three, that the British kings believed that, quote, Cymry had lost dominion over Lloegr, the Welsh name for England. It's important to acknowledge that Ashe never claims that Lloegr literally translates as the Lost Lands. In fact, he explicitly calls it the Welsh name for England, but he does define it, and I believe he is the first widespread text, if not the first text, to define it in this way: the lands conquered by the Anglo-Saxons, the lands lost by the Welsh, not England south of the Humber as had been popular in the preceding 4 centuries. It's not exact, but it's close, And all of this made me wonder, did the Dictionary of Celtic Mythology misinterpret this? It uses the same antiquated spelling as Ash and the same new definition. While the passage on Lloegr unfortunately doesn't have any citations, it's not unreasonable that, while writing the Dictionary of Celtic Mythology, the author could have consulted the popular Mythology of the British Isles, which then led to them adding Lloegr with a Y to their book, defining it as the lands lost to the Saxons like Ash, and calling it the Lost Territory in quotes, perhaps misinterpreting Ash when he said that the Welsh referred to the conquering of England as the loss of Lloegr. Or perhaps not actually intending for this to be seen as a translation, even though it really looks like it. Regardless, this is the earliest occurrence of this term I could find, and the margin of error here is thankfully very narrow. Unlike what we've seen claimed, the origins of the Lost Lands is not in the medieval era. It doesn't rest within books on Welsh mythology or with the ancient Welsh scholars. It isn't based on old Trioeds, and it wasn't created through a hoax. Instead, it lies here, in 1992. Lloegr is old, potentially 1,300 years old, possibly predating England by centuries, and yet despite this, no one knows what it means. We've seen plenty of theories, most of which are a bit wonky, but historians have come up with a couple reasonable ones. The linguist R. Matasowicz suggests that this could be related to the Old Irish word for warrior, with its roots in Celtic and Proto-Indo-European. Lloegr in this case could then mean warriors, based on a Welsh word that has now fallen out of use. The historian Eric Hamp also compares it to two Old Irish words, theorising that Lloegr means near a border, essentially the Welsh version of the Germanic Wales. Hamp also makes an interesting observation that Lloegr originally seems to be what he calls a shifter, not someone who has a job, a concept I clearly haven't heard of, but instead a term that moves. He theorised that Lloegr originally just referred to the Anglo-Saxons that lived across the border from the Britons, such as in the north and the Midlands, hence why they also refer to other distinct areas, like Ynys and Caint. And I think this is exactly the reason why the Lost Lands became so popular, why a major historical fiction author saw it and included it in his books, why people were told it as kids and grew up to post about it online, why people tried time and time again to add it to Wikipedia articles, and why you can still, to this very day, find it everywhere if you look in the right places. Because it just makes sense. The historian John Davis says that the medieval poem Armes Prydain Fawr displays a deep sense of loss. It seems like plenty of medieval Welsh rulers, bards and priests thought that Lloegr did belong to them, that they were the rightful inheritors from the Roman Empire. But they never claimed that Lloegr literally meant the Lost Lands. In fact, they never seem to have used that term at all. People have made the argument that it just makes sense several times before, but as this user once replied, that just isn't good enough. You could create a dozen translations for any country name in the world that could make sense in a historical context, but that doesn't make it true, and I think the fact that Lloegr is a word from Welsh made this problem a lot worse. If you don't speak Welsh, then you aren't going to immediately see that Lloegr doesn't contain any of the words for lost or land, and there are a lot more English speakers than Welsh ones. We've even seen several times where someone's knowledge of Welsh didn't help because they doubted their own ability while questioning this translation. In the end, I think that's exactly why it spread so far. It makes sense, it's a very poetic translation charged with historical context, and it's in a language that most people won't be able to understand and dispute. If you like, we can do an exercise. Did you know that England literally translates as the land of the sea, referring to its island position and strong naval traditions? Did you know that the United States is a Native American name, literally translating into the Lost Lands? That just makes sense. But with these names, you can point to them and say, no, of course they don't mean that, they mean this, the land of the Angles, the United States. These names are in English, and there are over 1 billion people on Earth who could argue with you about these meanings. But you can't do that with Lloegr, and there is no solid definition to point to. Despite how long it's been around, we have no idea what this name means, and we probably never will. Lloegr is one of the most bizarre names on Earth, in my opinion. Potentially predating England by several hundred years, and yet we have no idea where it came from, what it means, and where it originally applied to. But it doesn't mean the Lost Lands. Despite the videos, the comments, the books, and the articles, this name has never been able to translate like this. It's been claimed as an ancient folk etymology, as a term from over 1,000 years ago, originating in the myths, the old scholars, and the Trioeds of Wales. Yet I'd wager that almost everyone arguing over this translation back in 2005 were actually older than it was. In the end, no one purposefully obfuscated and rewrote history. Plenty of people had a source whether they knew it or not, and the author Bernard Cornwell, the man who I believe popularised this, also had a source. Unfortunately in this case it just wasn't a very accurate one, as it adopted a definition from an accomplished historian and created a new translation of this name, perhaps misunderstanding what that historian was saying. From the medieval era to 1990, Lloegr was transformed from England to the lands south of the Humber, and from 1990 to 1992 it became the lands lost to the Anglo-Saxons to literally the Lost Lands. But hey, it made for a great story, but in the end, that's all it ever was. Thank you for watching.